Welcome to my channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. The thermometer in my Toyota Camry read -12 when I pulled off Highway 169, 7 miles northwest of Minneapolis. My headlights caught the weathered sign. Lake Calhoun, private property. No trespassing after dark. But I had permission. The key to cabin 14 jangled in my coat pocket. A gift from my late grandmother's estate lawyer just 3 days ago. "Your grandmother specifically wanted you to have this property," he'd said, sliding the envelope across his mahogany desk. "Though I must warn you, the locals have stories about that lake." Stories, right. Like the one about water that freezes from the bottom up, defying every law of physics I learned at the University of Minnesota. But here's the thing that made me slam my brakes that December night, making my coffee tumble onto the passenger floor. Through the frost-covered windshield, I saw it. The lake was glowing. Not reflecting moonlight, glowing from beneath. If you're listening to this in bed right now, trying to fall asleep, I need you to understand something. What happened at Lake Calhoun changed everything I thought I knew about the natural world. And if you live anywhere near Minneapolis, you might want to pay attention. Because what's under that ice, it's still there, waiting. Let me tell you how the story begins. The cabin smelled like pine needles and something else, something metallic that caught in the back of my throat. I'd driven up from my apartment in uptown Minneapolis after work, thinking I'd spend the weekend cleaning out Grandma Ruth's old place before putting it on the market. The realtor said lakefront property this close to the city could fetch $500,000, even with the bizarre local reputation. I remember setting my duffel bag on the creaking hardwood floor, and that's when I found her journal, leather-bound, sitting on the kitchen table like she'd left it there yesterday, though she'd been gone for 3 months. The first entry was dated November 1962. "The lake spoke to me today," it read. "Not in words, but in patterns beneath the ice. Harold thinks I'm going senile, but I know what I saw. The ice formed from the bottom first, pushing upward like something was trying to escape." Harold was my grandfather. He died when I was 5. Drowned in that very lake on a July afternoon when the water was supposedly 72 degrees and calm as glass. The police report said heart attack. But Grandma Ruth's journal, it told a different story. I flipped through decades of entries while the Minnesota wind rattled the windows. Each winter she documented the same phenomenon. Ice forming in impossible ways, lights pulsing from the lake bed, and the sounds. She wrote about sounds that made the local deer avoid the shoreline from December through March. December 15th, 1987. Sarah's boy fell through the ice today. When they pulled him out 4 hours later, he was alive. Hypothermia should have killed him in 15 minutes, but he was breathing. His lips were blue, his skin like tissue paper, but breathing. He won't say what he saw down there. Just rocks back and forth in the hospital bed, whispering about the shapes in the ice. Sarah's boy. That would be Tommy Anderson. I went to high school with him, before he dropped out junior year and moved to California without telling anyone. I remember he never went swimming in gym class, always had a doctor's note. The wooden stairs groaned under my feet as I climbed to the bedroom, dragging my finger along the dusty banister. That's when I heard it for the first time. A sound like, have you ever put your ear against a freezer door? That low electrical hum? It was coming from outside, from the direction of the lake. I pressed my face against the cold window glass, and my breath fogged it instantly. But through the condensation I could see the ice. It wasn't smooth like normal lake ice. It had patterns, geometric patterns that reminded me of the frost on my car windshield, but deliberate, like someone had drawn them from underneath. My phone buzzed, a text from my mom. "Did you make it to the cabin okay? Remember what I told you about that place?" She'd been cryptic when I mentioned spending the weekend there. "Just don't go out on the ice," she'd said. "Promise me." I'd laughed it off, but standing there in my grandmother's bedroom, watching those patterns pulse with a faint blue light, I wasn't laughing anymore. The rational part of my brain, the part that got a degree in mechanical engineering, tried to explain it. Bioluminescent algae, maybe. Trapped gases creating optical illusions. But then I saw something that made every scientific explanation crumble. The ice was moving, not cracking or shifting like normal ice. Moving, breathing, like the lake had lungs, and they were slowly expanding and contracting beneath that frozen surface. I grabbed my North Face jacket and headed outside. The thermometer by the back door read -18 now. My breath came out in clouds that hung in the still air. The snow crunched under my sorrel boots, that distinctive Minnesota winter sound that's both comforting and isolating. The path to the lake was marked by old fishing posts my grandfather had installed in the 60s. Each one had a small reflector that caught my flashlight beam. As I got closer to the shore, that humming sound grew louder. Not louder exactly, deeper, like it was resonating in my chest cavity. That's when I saw the first hole. Perfect circle, maybe 3 feet across. The edges were smooth, too smooth, like they'd been melted rather than cut. I kneeled beside it, shining my flashlight down into the dark water. The beam penetrated maybe 10 feet before being swallowed by blackness. But in those 10 feet, I saw them. Fish. Dozens of them. But they weren't swimming, they were suspended. Frozen in place, but still alive. Their gills slowly moving, eyes tracking my flashlight beam. Walleye, northern pike, bass, all hanging motionless like someone had pressed pause on nature itself. I reached for my phone to take a picture, and that's when a hand grabbed my shoulder. I nearly fell into the hole. Wouldn't do that if I were you. The voice belonged to Jim Carlson, the neighbor my grandmother had mentioned in her journal. He was wearing a vintage Minnesota Wild jersey under his parka, breath reeking of Grain Belt beer. Flash photography makes them agitated. Makes what agitated? My voice came out higher than intended. He looked at the hole, then at me, then back at the hole. "You really don't know, do you? Ruth never told you about the arrangement." Arrangement, that word made my skin crawl. Jim sat down on an overturned bait bucket, his knees creaking in the cold. "Your grandmother was the keeper. Every generation, one person maintains the balance, feeds them, keeps them calm. When Ruth passed, we thought maybe they'd chosen someone else. But then you showed up. Feeds what?" But even as I asked, part of me already knew. Those patterns in the ice weren't random, they were a language, and something down there was writing messages, waiting for someone who could read them. "Started in 1847, Jim continued, pulling a flask from his pocket. "First settlers found this lake already frozen in the middle of August. When they tried to break through, the ice reformed from the bottom up, pushed their tools right out. Native Americans wouldn't come near it, called it the breathing water." He offered me the flask. I took it. The whiskey burned, but it helped with the shaking that had nothing to do with the cold. Every 30 years or so, someone goes missing. Always in winter. Always near the holes. Police say they fell through, but bodies never surface. Not even in spring when normal drowning victims float up. He pointed at the hole between us. "They don't float because they're not dead. They're down there, part of the ecosystem now." I wanted to laugh, wanted to call him crazy. But I'd seen those fish, suspended like insects in amber, clearly alive despite being motionless in near-freezing water. What do they eat? The question escaped before I could stop it. Jim stood up slowly. Memory. They eat memory. Why do you think Tommy Anderson can't remember anything before his accident? Why your grandfather forgot your grandmother's name in those last moments before he went under? The lake takes what it needs, and sometimes it takes more. A crack echoed across the ice. Not the sharp crack of breaking, but something deeper. Like knuckles popping but amplified 1,000 times. The patterns in the ice started shifting, rearranging themselves into new configurations. "It's almost feeding time," Jim whispered. "Midnight, your grandmother never missed it. Kept them satisfied with small offerings. Photographs, letters, little pieces of the past. But they've been hungry for 3 months now, getting restless." As if in response, the water in the hole began to bubble. Not boiling, but churning with movement from below. Something was rising. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to get back to the cabin, pack my things, drive back to Minneapolis and pretend this never happened. But I stayed. Maybe it was morbid curiosity. Or maybe something in my DNA, some genetic programming passed down from my grandmother, kept my feet planted on that frozen shore. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. My phone showed -23 now, the kind of cold that makes your nostrils stick together when you breathe, the kind that kills car batteries and makes you question why anyone ever settled in Minnesota. But the cold felt distant, unimportant compared to what was happening in front of me. Jim pulled out an old Polaroid camera from his jacket. "Your grandmother always documented the feedings," he said. "But the photos, they never developed quite right. Look." He handed me a stack of instant photos. Each one showed the lake, but where the holes should have been, there were gaps in the photographs themselves. Not black spots, actual holes in the paper, perfectly circular, as if something had burned through from the other side. "The lake doesn't like being captured," he explained. "It takes a piece of every photo, claims it's privacy tax." But Ruth kept trying, said it was important to have proof, even imperfect proof. What emerged from the hole wasn't what I expected. Not some monster or creature, but water. Living water that defied gravity, rising in a column about 4 feet high, rotating slowly like a liquid tornado. And suspended within it, fragments, pieces of photographs, torn pages, jewelry, all spinning in that impossible water spout. "Ruth fed them well," Jim said softly. "But they're showing you their collection, looking for recognition, for connection." I leaned closer and gasped. A photograph circled past. My grandmother as a young woman, standing next to the lake in a 1950s summer dress, but her face was missing. Not torn away, absorbed, like the photo had been selectively erased. More fragments swirled by. A child's drawing of a house, a wedding ring. A purple heart medal, each item partially consumed. The most meaningful parts extracted like someone had fed on the emotional weight they carried. "What are they?" My voice barely a whisper. Jim shrugged. "Nobody knows. Been here longer than any of us. Maybe they're from somewhere else. Or maybe they're what happens when memory itself becomes conscious. All I know is they keep the lake alive. Fish shouldn't survive in water this cold, but they do. Plants grow under the ice all winter. And sometimes people who fall in come back changed but alive." The water column suddenly collapsed, splashing back into the hole with a sound like a sigh. The ice immediately began forming over it. That impossible bottom-up freeze my grandmother had documented. Within seconds, the hole was sealed, leaving only a slight depression in the surface. But the patterns in the ice, they'd changed. They spelled something now. Letters formed from frozen crystals, each one the size of my palm. "Feed us" or "Join us." My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone. Not to take a picture, but to check the time. 11:58 p.m., 2 minutes until midnight. 2 minutes to decide if I was going to continue my grandmother's work or abandon this lake to its hunger. What happens if no one feeds them? I asked. Jim's face went pale in the moonlight. Spring of '94. Ruth went to visit her sister in Florida for 2 weeks. When she came back, the Henderson family was gone, all 5 of them. House still had breakfast on the table, car in the driveway. But they were gone. Only thing left was their shoes, arranged in a circle on the ice. The humming grew louder. The ice began to crack, not breaking, but opening. Dozens of holes appearing in perfect formation, each one releasing a soft blue glow. The lake was waking up. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet. Inside was a photo of my ex-girlfriend, the one who'd left me for her coworker 6 months ago. The picture still hurt to look at, still carried weight. Will this work? Jim nodded. Pain works best, joy too, but pain is dense, nutritious. I dropped the photo into the nearest hole. It floated for a moment, then was pulled under by something I couldn't see. The blue glow intensified, and I felt something in my chest, a loosening, like a knot I'd carried for months had suddenly dissolved. The lake accepted my offering. The holes began to close, all except one. The one directly in front of me stayed open, and from its depths, something rose, a hand, human but not. Fingers too long, skin translucent like rice paper, veins glowing with that same blue light. It held something, a key, an old brass key attached to a leather cord. Take it, Jim urged. That's your inheritance, your real inheritance. I took the key. The moment it touched my skin, I understood. Not everything, but enough. The lake wasn't malevolent. It was hungry the way a newborn is hungry. Desperately, instinctively, without malice. And my family had been feeding it for generations. The key was warm, despite being pulled from frozen water. It pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. Around my neck, it felt like it had always belonged there. The boathouse, Jim said. That key opens the boathouse. Your grandmother kept the real records there, the ones that go back to the beginning. The hand withdrew into the darkness, and the final hole sealed itself. The lake went quiet, satisfied for now. I made my way to the boathouse, a structure I'd barely noticed earlier, hidden among the evergreens. The door opened smoothly despite decades of Minnesota winters. Inside, filing cabinets, dozens of them, each drawer labeled with years, 1847, 1855, 1856, 1864, and so on. I pulled out the earliest file. The paper was yellow, brittle, but the ink was still legible. A contract, written in English and something else. Symbols that hurt to look at directly. Agreement between the residents of Lake Calhoun and the dwellers beneath, it read. In exchange for prosperity, mild winters, and abundant fish, the surface dwellers agree to provide sustenance in the form of human memory and emotion. Failure to comply will result in collection of debt through direct consumption. Direct consumption. The Henderson family. I spent the rest of the night reading, learning about my family's role as keepers. The careful balance they'd maintained. The lake wasn't just taking, it was giving back. Every family that fed it regularly experienced strange luck. Kids got into good colleges despite average grades. Illnesses that should have been terminal went into remission. Lost items reappeared. But the cost was pieces of yourself. Memories that defined you. Emotions that shaped you. Feed the lake your pain, and you'd feel better, but you'd also lose the lesson that pain taught. Feed it your joy, and the happiness would fade like a dream upon waking. My phone rang at 3 a.m. My mother. I felt it, she said without preamble. The moment you took the key, I felt the responsibility transfer. You knew? I knew, but I couldn't be the one to tell you. It has to be chosen, not forced. That's part of the agreement. I looked out the boathouse window at the lake. The patterns had returned to random fractals. Beautiful, but meaningless. Or maybe meaningful in a way humans weren't meant to understand. What if I walk away? I asked. What if I go back to Minneapolis and never come back? My mother was quiet for a long moment. Then someone else will be chosen, randomly. Someone who won't understand the rules. Someone who might overfeed them or starve them. And either way, people will disappear. The weight of it settled on my shoulders like Minnesota snow. Soft at first, then crushing as it accumulated. How did Grandma do it for so long? She learned to feed them things that needed to go. Grief that had festered too long. Anger that served no purpose. Memories of people who'd hurt her. She turned the lake into a kind of therapy, letting go of things that weighed her down. I thought about all the things I carried. The bullying in middle school, the car accident that killed my best friend, the promotion I didn't get, the relationships that ended badly. So much weight, so much pain that served no purpose except to hurt. I'll do it, I heard myself say. I'll be the keeper. The moment the words left my mouth, the lake responded. Every hole opened at once, not demanding, but acknowledging, accepting. The blue light turned golden for just a moment, warm and welcoming. Then everything went dark. But not unconscious dark. This was different. I was standing, still by the lake, but the world had shifted. The stars above were wrong, constellations I'd never seen, moving slowly across the sky like they were swimming through thick oil. And the lake was above me too, a perfect mirror of itself, hanging in the sky like a massive chandelier made of black water. Jim was gone. The cabins were gone. There was just me, the ice beneath my feet, and the impossible lake above. You're in between now. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Not heard, felt, like it was vibrating through my bones. This is where we exist, between the water and the ice, between memory and forgetting. Shapes moved in the lake above me, not swimming, drifting. Human shapes, but stretched out like taffy, their forms distorted by whatever physics ruled this place. I recognized one, Tommy Anderson, but not the Tommy from high school. This was Tommy at every age simultaneously. Child, teenager, adult, elder, all superimposed on each other like a multiple exposure photograph. We're not prisoners. His voice reached me, though his mouth didn't move. We're archivists, every memory fed to the lake. Someone has to catalog it, organize it, keep it from dissolving into the collective. The ice beneath my feet became transparent. Below, I could see my world, the real world, but from underneath. Jim was still standing there checking his watch, completely unaware that I was gone. Or maybe I wasn't gone. Maybe I was in both places at once. Time moves differently here, Tommy continued. What feels like hours is only seconds outside. Your grandmother visited us once a month for 60 years. In here, we spent decades together. She taught us to sort the memories, to preserve the important ones and dissolve the poison. Other shapes drifted closer. The Henderson family. They looked peaceful. Not happy exactly, but not suffering. They were working, weaving something from strands of light that I realized were memories. Individual moments extracted from the offerings, being woven into something larger. What are you making? Mrs. Henderson turned to me. Or what I thought was Mrs. Henderson. Her face kept shifting between different expressions, different ages. A map, she said. A map of human experience. Every joy, every trauma, every small moment that seemed meaningless but wasn't. The things beneath the lake, they're trying to understand us, and we're helping them. The things beneath the lake. I still hadn't seen them, only their effects, their hunger, their strange gifts. "Do you want to see them?" Tommy asked. "Your grandmother did. Once, just once." Before I could answer, the ice beneath me dissolved. I fell, but falling upward, into the lake that hung above me like a dark sky. The water was warm, body temperature, and breathing it felt more natural than breathing air. And then I saw them. Imagine if loneliness became a living thing. If the space between heartbeats evolved consciousness. They weren't creatures in any sense we understand. They were absences that had learned to think. Gaps in reality that fed on what we discard. Our forgotten dreams, our suppressed memories, our discarded selves. They communicated not in words or images but in feelings, and what I felt was recognition. They knew me, had always known me. Every moment of sadness I'd experienced, every tear I'd shed alone in my apartment, every 3 a.m. anxiety attack, they'd been there. Feeding, yes, but also comforting in their strange way, taking the weight when it got too heavy. "We are the empty spaces in your stories," they conveyed somehow. The pauses between words, the silence after goodbye. "We exist because you needed somewhere to put the things too heavy to carry." One of them moved closer. Or maybe I moved closer to it. Hard to tell when you're floating in impossible water. It showed me something. Memories that weren't mine. My grandmother, as a young woman, standing at this same lake, making this same choice. But also my great-grandmother and hers, back and back and back. To that first settler in 1847 who stumbled upon this lake and made a deal they didn't fully understand. But before them, nothing. The lake was empty, waiting. "We came when you came," the absence explained. "Drawn by the depth of human memory. Your species thinks so loudly, feels so intensely. We were just nothing. Wandering voids between stars. But your pain called to us. Your joy, your fear, your love. All of it so bright, so dense with meaning. We had to taste it. And now you're trapped here? Not trapped, rooted. Like you plant roots in soil, we planted ourselves in your collective unconscious. The lakes are just windows, access points, places where the boundary is thin enough for exchange." I understood then. The lake wasn't just in Minnesota. It was everywhere water gathered and grew still. Every pond that reflected more than it should. Every well that echoed too long. Every puddle that showed you the wrong sky. I woke up in the cabin at sunrise. For a moment I thought it had all been a dream. Then I felt the key against my chest. Warm and pulsing with its own rhythm. But also, I remembered everything. The space between spaces, the archivists, the absences that fed on memory. On the kitchen table was a note I didn't remember writing. "Welcome to the family business, the previous keepers." I walked to the window. The lake was covered in fresh snow, pristine and peaceful. A family of deer stood at the shore, drinking from a small gap in the ice. They should have been afraid. Prey animals don't drink from dangerous water. But they knew. Somehow, they knew the lake was satisfied. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. But when I opened it, it wasn't a text. It was a photo. The picture I'd fed to the lake, but different. My ex-girlfriend's face was gone. But I was still there. And I was smiling, genuinely smiling. Like the pain had been surgically removed while leaving the lesson intact. I made coffee and sat on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the ice pink and gold. Jim walked by with his fishing gear. "They'll sleep until next month," he said. "Unless someone disturbs them, but February, February, they'll be hungry again. I nodded. I had a month to go through my apartment in Minneapolis, to gather all the painful memorabilia I'd held on to. The letters from my father before he left, the hospital bracelet from my miscarriage, the rejection letters from graduate schools, food for the lake. Weight I didn't need to carry anymore. But here's the thing, and this is why I'm telling you this story, why I need you to understand. The lake isn't unique. There are others, scattered across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, all the places where water freezes in winter and old families keep strange traditions. Think about it, haven't you noticed? Those small towns with too many missing person cases that never make national news. The ones where people say things like, "Don't swim in Crystal Lake after sunset," or "Stay away from Devil's Pond during the full moon." Every local has a story about someone who went out on the ice and came back. Different. Lighter. Like something had been lifted from them. I've been doing research, spending my days at the Minneapolis Public Library, going through old newspapers on microfilm. The patterns are there if you know how to look. Every 30 to 40 years, each lake has an incident. A family disappears. A child falls through ice that shouldn't have broken. Someone emerges from water that should have killed them. And always, there's a keeper. Someone who knows. Someone who feeds them. I found an online forum, password protected, hidden in the deep web. It's called the Feeders Network. Hundreds of us across the northern states, all bound to our lakes, all carrying the weight of this secret. We share tips, warn each other about hunger cycles, trade information about what memories work best as offerings. There's a woman in Duluth whose lake prefers happy memories. It turns them into northern lights that dance across the winter sky. A man in Traverse City who feeds his lake nightmares. And in exchange, everyone in town sleeps peacefully. A teenager in Madison who discovered her lake accepts homework stress. Every student who swims there during finals week passes their exams. But not all the lakes are benevolent. Some have gone sour from feeding on too much darkness. There's one in the Upper Peninsula that only accepts memories of violence. The town around it has the highest murder rate in Michigan. People creating food for the lake, and one in International Falls that feeds exclusively on childhood innocence. The elementary school closed down 20 years ago. No one will say why. Maybe you've noticed lakes that locals avoid. Places where the fish are too big, the water too dark, the ice too perfect. Maybe you've heard stories about people who disappeared and came back different, lighter. Like something had been lifted from them. Those lakes are hungry too, and they're looking for keepers. So if you inherit lakefront property from a distant relative, if you find old journals full of impossible stories, if you see ice forming from the bottom up, you have a choice to make. Feed them or join them. But choose quickly, because winter in Minnesota is long, and the lakes are patient only to a point. Last week I got a call from a lawyer in Duluth. My cousin, Sarah, the one I'd never met, had left me property. A cabin on a small lake about 40 miles from Lake Superior. The locals call it Mirror Lake because the ice is so smooth you can see your reflection in it. But here's what the lawyer didn't know, what the locals won't tell outsiders. Sometimes the reflection shows you at a different age. Sometimes it shows you making different choices. And sometimes it shows you the person you could have been if you just let go of the things that weigh you down. I'm driving up there tomorrow. The key around my neck has been pulsing faster lately, like it recognizes something, like it knows these lakes are connected somehow, part of something bigger, something that's been here since before Minnesota had a name. If you're still listening, if you made it this far, check your local lakes this winter. Look for the patterns in the ice. Listen for the humming. And if you find them, remember what I told you. They're not evil, they're hungry. And we all have things we need to let go. The question is, Are you brave enough to feed them, or will you become the food? Sweet dreams, if you can manage them. And hey, if this story kept you up, if it made you think, leave a comment. Tell me about the strange lakes in your area, the places people whisper about, the water that doesn't behave like water should. Because I'm starting to think they're everywhere. Waiting, watching, hungry. Story number 2. They found my journal 3 days ago, wedged between the rotting floorboards of what used to be cabin 13. The pages were water damaged, sure, but readable enough for them to track me down in Portland. The detective who called said they needed answers about what happened that summer in '87, said the families deserved closure. But how do you explain something that shouldn't exist? How do you tell grieving parents that their kids didn't just vanish? They were taken by something that feeds on innocence itself? I guess I'll start at the beginning. And if you're listening to this late at night, maybe turn on another light. Trust me on that one. The story begins now. The Greyhound bus wheezed to a stop at the edge of nowhere, Tennessee. June 15th, 1987. Through the grimy window I could see the wooden sign, Camp Watauga, where memories last forever. If only they knew how true that would be. My name's Marcus Webb, or was, before I legally changed it. I was 17 that summer, a junior counselor trying to earn college money. My mom had found the job listing in the Knoxville Gazette. Beautiful lakeside camp seeks responsible teens for summer counselor positions. The pay was decent, $300 a week plus room and board. For a kid from a single-parent home in Memphis, it was a gold mine. The other counselors were already there when I arrived. Sarah Martinez from Austin, all sunshine and optimism, with this laugh that made everyone smile. Tommy Chen from Seattle, quiet kid who wore thick glasses and read Stephen King novels during breaks. Rebecca Becca Thompson from Nashville, tough as nails, captain of her school's field hockey team. And Jake Morrison from Chicago, the type who peaked in high school and never let you forget it. Old man Hutchinson, the camp director, looked like he'd stepped out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Plaid shirt, suspenders, white beard. But his eyes, there was something off about them. Like he was always watching for something just beyond the tree line. "Welcome to Watauga," he said, his handshake firm but clammy. "You'll be in cabin 12, right next to 13. Sarah raised her hand. "I thought camp skipped 13, superstition and all." Hutchinson's smile tightened. "We're not superstitious here, Miss Martinez. Though," he paused, glancing toward the lake, "cabin 13 has been closed for repairs. Nobody goes in there, understood?" We all nodded, but I caught Tommy and Becca exchanging looks. The first week was perfect, almost too perfect. The kids arrived on Sunday, 47 of them, ages 8 to 14. My group had 7 boys, all assigned to cabin 11. There was Dylan, this freckled kid from Birmingham who collected baseball cards. Marcus, yeah, same name as me, from Atlanta, wouldn't stop talking about the Braves. Twin brothers Sam and Sean from Chattanooga who finished each other's sentences. Peter from Louisville, allergic to everything. Quiet Ben from Jackson, Mississippi, and Lucas from Orlando, the troublemaker who'd already been kicked out of 2 other camps. During the days, we did normal camp stuff, archery, swimming, capture the flag. The kids loved it. But at night, that's when things felt different. It started with the smell. Every evening around 9, just after lights out, this sweet, rotting odor would drift across the camp, like overripe peaches mixed with something metallic. Hutchinson said it was just the lake, algae bloom or something. But lakes don't smell like that. I grew up fishing with my uncle on Reelfoot Lake. I know what water smells like. Then there were the sounds. Cabin 13 sat empty, supposedly, but at night you could hear things. Footsteps on old wood, whispers that weren't quite English. Once I swear I heard a child crying, but when I grabbed my flashlight to investigate, Jake stopped me. "Don't," he said, his usual cockiness gone. Hutchinson wasn't joking about staying out. "You've been here before?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Last summer. Different counselors then, except me. They all quit after what?" But he just shook his head and rolled over in his bunk. The second week brought changes. Subtle at first, like the way milk sours gradually until suddenly it's wrong. The lake, usually crystal clear, had taken on a greenish tinge. Not algae. I'd seen algae blooms before. This was different. The water looked thick, almost syrupy, and fish had started washing up on shore. Not dead. That would have made sense. These fish were alive but wrong. They'd flop on the beach with their mouths open, but no sound came out. Their eyes, God, their eyes followed you when you walked past. Becca found the first one during swimming lessons. A largemouth bass, probably 5 pounds, just floating at the surface. When she reached for it with the pool skimmer, it turned its head like a person would, and looked right at her. She dropped the skimmer and backed away, trying to play it cool for the kids, but I saw her hands shaking for the rest of the day. "The lake's sick," old Gerald, the maintenance man, told me that evening. He'd worked at the camp since the 60s. Probably the only person besides Hutchinson who really knew its history. "Happens every 6 years, like clockwork. Fish go weird, water turns, and then..." He stopped, glancing at cabin 13. "Then what?" "Then they feed." Before I could ask more, Hutchinson appeared. The man had a talent for showing up whenever someone started talking about the camp's past. Gerald suddenly remembered he had to fix something and hurried off, but not before pressing something into my hand. A key, old and rusty, with a tag that read, "Records Room, Basement." That night, after lights out, I couldn't stop thinking about that key. Tommy must have noticed me fidgeting because he whispered from his bunk, "What's eating you, Marcus?" I showed him the key. His eyes lit up behind his glasses. The kid loved a mystery. "We should check it out," he said. "Now? When else? During Capture the Flag when Hutchinson's watching us like a hawk?" He had a point. We slipped out around midnight, leaving Jake in charge. Not that he was sleeping anyway. The main lodge loomed in the darkness, all shadows and sharp angles. The basement door was around back, hidden behind a tangle of kudzu that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The key turned with a grinding sound that made my teeth ache. Inside, stairs descended into black nothing. Tommy had brought a flashlight, of course he had, and we made our way down. The smell hit immediately, mildew and old paper and something else, something sweet and rotten. The records room was exactly what you'd expect. Filing cabinets, boxes, shelves of moldering ledgers, but Tommy went straight to a specific cabinet like he knew exactly what he was looking for. "How did you—" "I came here last night too," he admitted, but I was too scared to look alone. Inside were files, dozens of them, each labeled with a year, 1963, 1969, 1975, 1981. But that's not what made my blood freeze. It was the photos. Black and white at first, then color as the years progressed. Always 7 children. Always smiling in a group photo in front of cabin 13. And always in the background of each photo, something wrong. A shadow where there shouldn't be one. A face in the trees that didn't belong to any counselor. In one from 1975, all 7 kids had the same expression. Not just similar, but identical, like someone had copied and pasted the same face 7 times. "Look at this," Tommy whispered, pulling out a journal. The leather cover was stained with something dark. It was from 1963, written by a counselor named Robert Hayes. His early entries were normal. Kids arriving, activities, minor disputes. But by week 2, things changed. June 23rd. The children in cabin 13 have stopped eating. They say they're not hungry, but I catch them at night, standing at the windows, licking the glass. Their tongues leave marks that won't wash off. June 26th. Found them in a circle at 3 a.m. holding hands, speaking in unison. Language I don't recognize. When I broke the circle, they screamed. All of them, same pitch, same duration, 16 seconds exactly. I counted. June 29th. They're not the same children anymore. They look the same, sound the same, but something's wearing them like clothes. I can see it when they think no one's watching. The way their faces slip, like masks that don't quite fit. July 2nd. Last entry. They're coming for me tonight. I can hear them outside my cabin, scratching at the walls, not with their fingers, with something else. If someone finds this, don't let them take 7. It needs 7 to... The entry ended mid-sentence. A dark stain covered the bottom of the page. Tommy found another file. This one from 1981. Photos of search parties, police reports, and a psychiatric evaluation of the only counselor who'd witnessed the disappearance. Jake Morrison. Our Jake. He'd been 11, visiting his older brother who worked at the camp. The evaluation was disturbing. Jake had told the psychiatrist about shadow children who came out of cabin 13, about how they moved wrong, like film played backwards, about how they took the 7 kids and his brother who'd tried to stop them. The psychiatrist diagnosed him with trauma-induced psychosis, recommended immediate institutionalization. No wonder he came back, Tommy muttered. He's trying to prove he's not crazy. A floorboard creaked above us, then another. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. We froze. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. Then a voice, but not from above, from right behind us. Curious boys shouldn't wander at night. We spun around. Hutchinson stood there, but I swear he hadn't come down the stairs. He'd just existed there suddenly, like he'd always been standing in that spot. "Mr. Hutchinson," I started. "We were just looking for answers, I know." He moved closer, and in the flashlight beam, his shadow fell in 2 different directions. "Some answers are worse than questions, boy. Some truths eat you from the inside." He took the journal from Tommy's hands, gentle but firm. 1963 was a bad year. Robert Hayes thought he could stop it, thought he could save them. You know what happened to him. We shook our heads. They found him 3 states over, walking along a highway. No memory of who he was, where he'd been. Only thing he'd say was 7 for 7 for 7. Spent the rest of his life in an asylum, drawing pictures of children with no faces. He ushered us toward the stairs. "Go back to your cabins. Forget what you've seen. In 4 more days, camp ends, you go home, and this becomes a story nobody believes." "But the kids in our cabins," Tommy protested, "will be fine if you don't interfere. It doesn't want them. It wants..." He paused, looking directly at me. "It wants what it's already chosen." By the end of week 2, the kids were getting restless. Lucas especially. He'd been pushing boundaries since day 1, sneaking candy, starting fights, trying to peek in the girls' cabins. But on that Tuesday night, he went too far. I woke up around 2 in the morning. My throat was dry, needed water. That's when I noticed Lucas's bunk was empty. Then I saw it. The door to cabin 13 was open. Not much, maybe 6 inches, but enough to see darkness that seemed thicker than it should be. My feet moved before my brain could stop them. The grass was wet with dew, cold between my toes. As I got closer, that sweet rot smell got stronger, made my eyes water. I could hear Lucas inside talking to someone. "Promise you'll show me?" he was saying. "Cross your heart?" Another voice answered, but it was wrong, like multiple people speaking in unison, their words slightly out of sync. "Cross our hearts, Lucas, all of them." I pushed the door open. The hinges screamed, that horror movie sound that makes your spine tingle. Inside, Lucas stood in the center of the cabin surrounded by nothing. Just empty bunks and moonlight streaming through holes in the roof. But the shadows were moving independently of anything that could cast them. "Lucas," I whispered, "we need to go. Now." He turned to me and his eyes, God, his eyes were solid black. Not the iris, not the pupil. Everything. Like someone had poured oil into his sockets. "They want to play, Mr. Marcus," he said, his voice layered like the other one. "They've been waiting so long to play." I grabbed him, harder than I should have, and dragged him out. The moment we crossed the threshold, he went limp. Started crying. His eyes were normal again, brown and terrified. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. They said they were lonely. I should have reported it. Should have woken Hutchinson, called Lucas's parents, done something, anything. But I was 17 and stupid and convinced myself it was just a nightmare. I tucked Lucas back in bed, told him it was just a bad dream, and spent the rest of the night watching that cabin door. It never closed on its own. I had to do it at sunrise, and when I touched the handle, my palm came away covered in something dark and sticky. In the morning light, it looked like old blood. Sarah noticed my hand at breakfast. "What happened?" "Cut it on something," I lied. She frowned, but didn't push. Tommy, though. Tommy saw right through me. After the kids went to arts and crafts, he pulled me aside. "You went in there, didn't you?" "Lucas did. I just pulled him out." Tommy's face went pale behind his glasses. "We need to talk. All of us. Even Jake." We gathered in the equipment shed during lunch. Sarah, Becca, Tommy, Jake, and me. Jake looked worse than I'd ever seen him. Hollow eyes, 3-day stubble, hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "It's happening again," Jake said without preamble. "Same as 81, I was here, visiting my brother Danny. He was 19, first year as a counselor." Sarah leaned forward. "What happened to him?" "He tried to stop them from taking the kids. The shadows, they took him too, but not like the kids. The kids just vanished. Danny they left behind. Part of him, anyway." "What do you mean, part of him?" Becca asked. Jake pulled out his wallet, extracted an old photo. A young man, handsome, smiling, standing in front of the camp sign. This was Danny before. 2 weeks later, they found him wandering in the woods. He looked exactly the same, but Jake's voice cracked. But he was hollow, like someone had scooped out everything that made him Danny and left just the shell. He didn't recognize me, didn't recognize our parents, still doesn't. He's in a facility in Chicago now, just sits there, staring at nothing, whispering numbers. "What numbers?" Tommy asked, ever the investigator. "Coordinates, latitude and longitude. Different ones every day, but always places where children have gone missing. Parks, schools, other camps, like he's tracking something." The shed went quiet. Outside, we could hear kids laughing, playing tetherball, being normal. It felt like a different world. "There's more," I said, and told them about the basement, the records, what Hutchinson had said. Tommy backed me up, adding details I'd missed. "So, every 6 years, this thing takes 7 kids from cabin 13, Becca summarized. "And we're coming up on the 3rd week when it happens. We need to get the kids out," Sarah said. "Call their parents, make up some emergency." "Won't work," Jake interrupted. "My brother tried that. Parents showed up to collect their kids, but their cars wouldn't start. Phones stopped working. Roads out of camp kept leading back to camp. It doesn't let anyone leave until it's fed." "Then we protect them," I said. "We keep watch, you don't understand." Jake grabbed my shoulder, his fingers digging in. It doesn't just take them, it chooses them, marks them somehow, and once they're marked, he pulled up his sleeve. There, on his forearm, was what looked like a burn scar in the shape of a hand, a child's hand. This appeared the night before the taking in '81. One of the kids touched me in my sleep. Next day, that kid was gone. We all instinctively checked our arms. Nothing yet. "What about Hutchinson?" Becca asked. "He obviously knows what's happening." "Hutchinson's not what he seems," Jake said. "I've been watching him. He doesn't eat, ever. Have any of you seen him eat? And his cabin? I followed him one night. He went in the front door but never turned on any lights. I watched for 3 hours. Nothing. Next morning, he came out of the mess hall kitchen like he'd been there all night." "That's impossible," Sarah said, but her voice wavered. "Lots of impossible things here," Tommy muttered. "Question is, what do we do about it?" Before anyone could answer, the shed door flew open. Hutchinson stood there, backlit by the noon sun, his face in shadow. "Counselor meeting's over," he said, his voice flat. "Children need supervision." We filed out, but as I passed him, he grabbed my wrist. His hand was ice cold, despite the 90-degree heat. "You care about those boys," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Then stop digging. Some holes don't have bottoms, Marcus. Some holes are mouths." That afternoon, during swimming time, I kept watching my kids. Dylan had made friends with a boy from cabin 13, a quiet kid named Christopher who always wore long sleeves despite the heat. They were building sand castles by the shore, but something was off about Christopher's technique. He wasn't digging with his hands. He was sort of willing the sand to move, and it was obeying. The twins, Sam and Sean, had started a new game. They'd stand at opposite ends of the dock and mouth words to each other. No sound, just lip movements. But somehow they always knew what the other was saying. When I asked them about it, they said in perfect unison, "The water teaches us." Peter's allergies had completely disappeared. He was breathing clear for the first time all summer, but his eyes had developed a golden tint, like a cat's. Ben had started talking, but only to himself. Long, complex conversations in a language that sounded like Latin mixed with something older. When Tommy heard it, he went pale, and later told me it was Enochian, the supposed language of angels, or demons. The other Marcus had begun collecting things, rocks, feathers, bits of glass. He arranged them in patterns around his bunk, patterns that hurt to look at directly. When I tried to clean them up, my hand went numb for an hour. And Lucas had stopped sleeping. I'd check on him throughout the night, and he'd always be awake, staring at the ceiling, lips moving in silent conversation. "They're changing," Tommy said that evening. "All of them. It's like something's preparing them." "For what?" He showed me a book he'd found in the basement, one we'd missed before. It was handwritten in multiple languages, but one passage in English stood out. "The hollow ones need vessels. Young vessels, unmarked by the weight of years. 7 gates for 7 shadows, 7 mouths to speak the opening. When the stars align in the 6th year of the 6th cycle, they shall walk between. The camp is the threshold. The lake is the door. The children are the key." Below that, someone had written in pencil, "It's not taking them, it's becoming them." Wednesday arrived with thunderclouds, the kind that turn noon into twilight. The kids were anxious, cooped up in the mess hall doing craft projects while rain hammered the roof. But it wasn't just the weather. The very air felt wrong. Thick and electric, like breathing before a tornado. I noticed it first during breakfast. The kids from cabin 13 weren't eating. All 7 of them sat at their table, food untouched, staring at my boys. Not aggressively, more like scientists observing specimens. When I walked over to check on them, they turned their heads in perfect synchronization to watch me approach. "Everything okay, guys?" I asked. "Yes, Mr. Marcus," they answered in unison. Not unusual for kids to play that game, but their voices harmonized, creating undertones that shouldn't come from human throats. That's when I saw their counselor for the first time. Really saw him. David something or other, supposedly from Ohio. But looking at him now, in the gray stormlight, I realized he had no shadow. None at all. He stood by the window, watching the rain, and where his shadow should have been, there was just absence, like reality had been erased in that spot. He caught me staring and smiled. Too many teeth. Way too many teeth. During craft time, Dylan kept organizing and reorganizing his baseball cards. But the faces on them were changing. I swear I saw Babe Ruth's eyes follow me. Mickey Mantle's mouth was open in a silent scream, and one card that should have been Roger Maris, now showed a child's face, a boy I didn't recognize, wearing a Camp Watauga shirt from what looked like the 1960s. "Dylan, where did you get that card?" He looked up at me with eyes that weren't quite his anymore. "Christopher gave it to me. Said it was a special rookie card, said I'd be on one soon too." The twins wouldn't separate, even to go to the bathroom. They developed a new habit, finishing not just each other's sentences but other people's too. You'd start to say something, and they'd complete your thought before you'd formed it. "Mr. Marcus," Sam said. "You're worried about," Sean continued. "Tonight," they said together. "You should be," Sam added. "But not for us," Sean finished. Peter's allergies were acting up. Except instead of sneezing, he was wheezing words. Ancient words that Tommy later told me were Sumerian. Each wheeze was a different phrase. The door opens. 7 becomes 1. 1 becomes nothing. Ben hadn't spoken in 2 days, to us, but I'd caught him at the window the previous night having a full conversation with something outside. When I'd looked, nothing was there. But the grass was pressed down in footprints. Small footprints. 7 sets of them. Marcus, the other Marcus, kept asking when the sun would come back. Not unusual, except he wasn't looking at the clouded sky when he asked. He was looking at me. Into me. Through me. "The sun's been gone for years, Mr. Marcus," he said during lunch. "You just haven't noticed yet." And Lucas just stared at the window facing cabin 13. He'd drawn on his arm with marker, the same pattern the other Marcus had made with his collected objects. When I tried to wash it off, the marker wouldn't budge. It wasn't marker, it was under his skin, like a tattoo that had appeared from inside. "They're coming tonight," he whispered when I passed his table. "They told me in my dreams." I knelt beside him. "Who's coming, Lucas?" "The hungry ones. The kids who stayed too long. The ones who won the game in 63, 69, 75, 81. They get to come back every 6 years to play again, to find new friends." "What game, Lucas?" He smiled, that same too-many-teeth smile I'd seen on David. "Hide and seek. But when you're found, you're it forever." Before I could ask more, Hutchinson's hand landed on my shoulder. Heavy. Cold. But this time I noticed something else. His fingers, they had too many joints. Just slightly, barely noticeable, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. "Problem here, counselor?" "No, sir. Just checking on Lucas." His fingers tightened, and I felt them bend in ways fingers shouldn't. Boys will be boys. Best not to coddle them with attention-seeking behavior. Besides, he leaned in close and his breath smelled like earth from deep underground. "It's too late to change the rules now. The game's already started." That afternoon, we tried to prepare. Sarah had found salt in the kitchen and said it might work like in the movies. Tommy had his flashlights and a camp radio he'd rigged to pick up electromagnetic frequencies. Becca had road flares from the emergency kit. Jake had a baseball bat, and a look that said he'd die before letting history repeat. But how do you fight something that might not even be physical? How do you protect kids who might already be gone? As dinner approached, the storm intensified. Lightning struck the lake repeatedly, the same spot over and over like it was trying to break through something. The lights flickered. The kids from Cabin 13 didn't come to dinner. When I asked David where they were, he just pointed at Cabin 13. "They're preparing the welcome party," he said. "You're all invited." That night, I didn't even pretend to sleep. Neither did Tommy. I could see him in Cabin 10, sitting by his window with a flashlight. Sarah was awake too, playing cards with her girls by lantern light. Even Jake had dropped his tough guy act, making his kids push all their bunks together in the center of their cabin. At 11:47, every clock in camp stopped. I know because I was staring at my watch when the second hand just froze. Then, slowly, it started moving backwards. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. Our breath came out in clouds. The windows frosted over. In July, in Tennessee. But it wasn't normal frost. There were patterns in it. Faces. Dozens of tiny faces, all screaming. Then the smell hit, stronger than ever, like fruit rotting in a grave mixed with something chemical, like formaldehyde. It seeped through the walls, making my eyes water, my throat close. The door to Cabin 13 didn't open. It simply wasn't closed anymore. Like reality had blinked and missed the transition. Shadows poured out. Not metaphorically, but literally flowed like water across the ground. Where they touched the grass, it withered and blackened. But worse than the shadows were the things in them. Shapes that might have been children once, but stretched wrong, moving in stop-motion jerks like broken film. I heard them before I saw them clearly. Singing. A camp song I recognized, Kumbaya, but in reverse, the words twisted into something blasphemous. 7 voices from long ago, still young but ancient, innocent but corrupted. Lucas stood up in his bunk, those oil-black eyes reflecting nothing. "They're here," he said in that layered voice. "Time to play." The other boys started moving, not walking, but gliding, their feet barely touching the floor. Dylan left his cards scattered. The twins moved in perfect synchronization. Peter's breathing cleared for the first time all summer. Ben finally spoke, but in a language that hurt to hear. Marcus. The other Marcus smiled with too many teeth. I tried to stop them. God knows I tried. But my legs wouldn't work, like something was holding me down, pressing on my chest. I could only watch as all 7 boys filed out of the cabin, walking toward that darkness. Tommy burst through his door, flashlight swinging wildly. "No! Stop!" The beam hit the shadows and bent, actually bent, like light going through water. Sarah was screaming, trying to wake Hutchinson. Jake had 2 of his kids physically restrained, but they were fighting him with strength no child should have. My boys reached Cabin 13's threshold. As each one crossed, they flickered, like old TV static, there and not there. Lucas turned back to look at me one last time. For just a second, his eyes cleared. "Help me," he mouthed. Then the door slammed shut, and the night exploded with sound. Children laughing, crying, screaming, all at once, all from inside that cabin. The windows glowed with a light that wasn't light, something that made your eyes water to look at directly. I finally broke free of whatever held me and ran to the door. Locked, not just locked, sealed, like it had been painted shut for decades. I pounded on it until my fists bled, screaming their names. Inside, the sounds grew louder. Then suddenly stopped. Complete silence. Even the rain had paused. Hutchinson appeared beside me, fully dressed despite the hour. He wasn't surprised, wasn't panicked, just resigned. "Every 6 years," he said quietly. "It takes 7. No more, no less. The camp closes for a few years, reopens under new management, and people forget. You knew? I grabbed his shirt. You knew? My father knew. His father knew. Camp Watauga has been here since 1902, boy. Some things are older than that. Some hungers never die. We have to get them out. He shook his head. They're not in there anymore. Check for yourself. Jake had found a crowbar. Together, we pried the door open, splinters flying. Inside, nothing. Empty bunks covered in dust like no one had been there for years. Cobwebs in every corner, a thick layer of grime on the windows. But on the far wall, carved deep into the wood, were names. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. And at the bottom, still bleeding sap like fresh wounds. Dylan Mitchell, Marcus Washington, Sam Reeves, Sean Reeves, Peter Horvath, Ben Jackson, Lucas Castellano, my 7 boys. The police came at dawn, then the FBI, then parents. God, the parents. The official story was a kidnapping. Cult activity, they said. Hutchinson disappeared that same night, along with all the camp records. They found his truck at the bottom of the lake a week later, but no body. The other counselors and I were questioned for months. Polygraphs, psychologists, the works. Our stories matched because we'd agreed on the lie. The kids had been taken by someone in the night. We'd been drugged, we said. Couldn't remember details. Eventually, they had to let us go. Sarah moved to California, became a teacher. Never talks about that summer. Tommy went into computer programming. Builds security systems now, the kind that monitor everything. Jake killed himself 3 years later. Left a note that just said, I can still hear them. Me, I changed my name, moved to Portland, tried to forget. Got married, had kids of my own. Never let them go to summer camp. Never let them sleep with the door closed. Always checking, always watching. But every 6 years, I dream about that cabin. And in those dreams, I see them. My 7 boys. They haven't aged a day. Dylan still organizing phantom baseball cards. The twins still finishing each other's sentences. Peter breathing clear and easy. Ben speaking in tongues. Marcus with too many teeth. And Lucas with his black eyes asking me why I didn't save them. Last week, I got a letter. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting, Hutchinson's. Inside was a newspaper clipping, Historic Camp Watauga to reopen after extensive renovations. The date at the bottom, this summer, 2024, 37 years later, 6 years times 6 plus 1. I called the number in the article, tried to warn them. The new director laughed it off, said they'd removed all the old cabins, built new ones, said they don't even have a cabin 13. They skipped from 12 to 40 like proper superstitious folks. But I know the truth. It doesn't matter what number you put on the door, that thing, that hunger. It's in the land itself, in the lake, in the trees, waiting. So, if you're listening to this, if your kids are begging to go to summer camp, ask questions, real questions. How long has the camp been there? What's its history? And if they mention Camp Watauga, if they mention Tennessee, if they mention lakeside cabins and activities that sound too good to be true, don't send them. Because every 6 years it feeds, and it's always hungry for 7. They found my journal 3 days ago, like I said. The detective, a woman named Chen, maybe related to Tommy, I never asked. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. We found something else, she said, sliding a photo across the table. It was cabin 13, not from 1987, from last week. Fresh paint, new number on the door, cabin 14. But in the window, barely visible, 7 small handprints on the glass, from the inside. We measured them, Chen said. They match your missing boys exactly. 37 years old, but fresh as yesterday. I looked at the photo closer. In the corner, so faint I almost missed it, was writing in the condensation, "Still playing, still waiting. Come back, Mr. Marcus." My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number, just coordinates, and a date. Tomorrow. The 6th year isn't over yet. And I think they want an 8th player. If you're listening to this before tomorrow night, and you don't hear from me again, you'll know why. Some games never end. Some players never leave. And some camps never really close. Check on your kids tonight. Hold them close. And whatever you do, stay away from Camp Watauga. Because I'm going back. I have to. Those were my boys. My responsibility. And maybe, just maybe, if I play their game. But you know what the really terrifying part is? The part that keeps me awake every single night? Sometimes, late at night, when everything's quiet and I'm almost asleep, I hear Lucas whisper, "We're not the only camp." Sweet dreams. And hey, if this story kept you up, if you're looking over your shoulder right now, wondering about that summer camp you went to as a kid, the one with that weird cabin nobody talked about, leave a comment below. Tell me your camp's name. I'm making a list. Someone has to. Story number 3. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when I first saw them. Not just saw them. Watched them arrange themselves into letters on my grandmother's lawn in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Letters that spelled out a single word that made my blood run cold. Remember. If you're listening to this right now, lying in bed, maybe with the lights off, I need you to understand something. This isn't just a story. This is a warning. And by the time I'm done telling you what happened that autumn in Millbrook, you'll never look at a rainy day the same way again. But before we dive into the nightmare, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you're going to want to hear how this ends. And if you've ever seen earthworms after rain doing something unusual, leave a comment below. I have a feeling I'm not the only one who's witnessed this. The story begins now. I inherited my grandmother's house on October 3rd, a Tuesday. The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and disappointment, the kind of place where dreams go to get notarized. Mr. Harrison pushed his glasses up his nose and slid the keys across his mahogany desk. "Your grandmother specifically requested you receive the property," he said, his voice carrying that professional sympathy lawyer's perfect after years of practice. She was quite insistent. What he didn't tell me then, what I wouldn't discover until later, was that I wasn't her first choice. According to the original will, dated 6 months before her death, the house was supposed to go to my cousin Marcus, a nice, normal accountant from Pittsburgh who would have sold it immediately and never looked back. But something had changed Grandma Eleanor's mind in those final months. The amended will, hastily written in her shaking handwriting just 3 weeks before she passed, specified that I must live in the house for a minimum of 1 year. If I failed to do so, it would be donated to the city for demolition. I hadn't seen Grandma Eleanor in 5 years, not since the incident at Thanksgiving when she'd grabbed my wrist, her fingers cold as November rain, and whispered, "They're trying to tell us something, Katie. The earth remembers everything." My parents had chalked it up to early dementia. I'd wanted to believe them. God, how I'd wanted to believe them. The house sat on Sycamore Street, a 2-story colonial that had been in our family since 1952. White shutters, red door, the kind of place Norman Rockwell would have painted if he'd had a thing for subtle dread. The lawn stretched out like a green carpet, too perfect, too maintained for a house that had been empty for 3 months. But as I stood there, keys heavy in my palm, I noticed something odd. The grass wasn't just maintained. It was pristine, almost artificially so. Each blade stood at attention, uniformly green despite the October chill. And the soil looked rich, dark, almost hungry. Mrs. Chen from next door emerged from her house as I pulled into the gravel driveway. She was a small woman, maybe 70, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. "You must be Katie," she said, approaching with a covered dish. "Eleanor talked about you constantly. All good things, I hope?" Her smile wavered slightly. "She was worried about you. Said you had the sight but didn't know it yet." Mrs. Chen glanced at the perfect lawn, then back at me. "She asked me to give you this when you arrived." The dish was heavy, still warm. Lasagna, by the smell of it. But underneath the foil was an envelope marked with my name in Grandma Eleanor's familiar script. "She made me promise to watch over the house until you came," Mrs. Chen continued. "I've been maintaining the lawn. Seemed important to keep it healthy." I pulled into the gravel driveway as the first drops of rain began to fall. October rain in Pennsylvania has a particular quality to it. Cold enough to chill your bones, heavy enough to flood your basement, persistent enough to drive you mad. The weather app on my phone showed 3 days of solid precipitation ahead. Perfect, I thought. Just perfect. The key turned in the lock with a click that echoed through the empty foyer. Everything was exactly as I remembered. The grandfather clock in the corner, the faded photographs climbing the stairway wall, the lingering scent of lavender and something else, something earthier. But there were additions too, things I didn't remember from childhood visits, crystals on the windowsills, mirrors hung at odd angles, and in the living room, a bookshelf filled with volumes I'd never seen before. Earth energies and spiritual communication, the language of the soil, when the dead speak through nature. I spent that first day unpacking, trying to make the guest bedroom feel less like a museum exhibit. The master bedroom was still too much Grandma Eleanor, her reading glasses on the nightstand, her crossword puzzle half finished on the bed. 7 across, messages from below. 8 letters. She'd filled in warnings. As evening approached, I opened the envelope Mrs. Chen had given me. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small brass key I didn't recognize. "My dearest Katie, if you're reading this, then they've started again. By now, you've probably noticed the lawn. How perfect it looks. How eager. Don't be afraid of what you see. Our family has always been able to hear what others cannot. It skipped your mother, but it's strong in you. I could see it even when you were small." The key opens a box in the basement, behind the furnace, beneath the loose stone. Inside, you'll find everything I should have told you years ago. Everything I was too frightened to share. They're not evil, Katie. They're just lost. They need someone who can listen. Someone who can help them find peace. The rain will bring them to the surface. Don't fight it. Let them tell their story. With love and regret, Grandma Eleanor P.S. Mrs. Chen knows more than she admits. When you're ready for the truth, ask her about the summer of 1978. That night, the rain intensified. I lay in the twin bed of my childhood visits, listening to the water hammer against the windows. But there were other sounds too. Sounds I'd been hearing all my life but never really acknowledged. A whisper in the walls, a sighing in the floorboards, and underneath it all, that dragging sound, like fingers through mud. Slow, deliberate. Around midnight, I crept to the window and peered through the curtains. The streetlight cast an eerie glow across the yard, and there, scattered across the wet grass, were hundreds of earthworms. They moved with purpose, not randomly as I'd expected. Streams of them flowing like pink rivers across the dark soil. I told myself it was just the gutters overflowing. Old houses make noise. That's what rational people tell themselves at 3 a.m. But even as I thought it, I knew I was lying to myself. The next morning, coffee mug warming my hands. I stood at the kitchen window and saw them. Hundreds of earthworms scattered across the back lawn. Nothing unusual about that. Worms surface during rain to avoid drowning in waterlogged soil. Basic biology. But these weren't scattered randomly. My mug slipped from my fingers, shattering on the linoleum floor. Hot coffee splashed across my bare feet, but I barely felt it, because there, spelled out in perfect Arial font made of writhing pink bodies, was my name. Katie. I ran outside, bare feet slipping on the wet grass. Up close, the precision was even more disturbing. Each letter was formed by dozens of worms, aligned so perfectly it looked like someone had used a stencil. The K was 6 feet tall. The spacing between letters was exact, and they were still moving, adjusting their positions, perfecting the formation. I could hear them, a sound like wet leather being dragged across concrete. But underneath that, something else, something that might have been whispering if I let myself believe such things were possible. I grabbed the garden hose, my hands shaking, and blasted them apart. They scattered, rolling and tumbling across the lawn, natural behavior, random movement. Within minutes, they'd reformed. Katie, why? This time I used a rake, scattered them to the 4 corners of the yard, watched them crawl back, inexorably, to form new words. Some moved in straight lines, others followed complex patterns, weaving between obstacles with impossible precision. It was like watching a living computer program execute itself. Hattie, why did? My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, waved from her porch next door. Quite the rain we're having, she called out, seemingly oblivious to the impossible thing happening in my yard. Could she not see it? Was I losing my mind? But when I looked closer, I noticed her eyes weren't on me. They were on the lawn. And her smile didn't reach her eyes. I went inside and called my sister in California. Melissa answered on the 3rd ring, her voice thick with sleep. It was only 6 a.m. there. Mel, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Katie, what's wrong? Is this about Grandma's house? The worms, they're spelling things. Silence, then. Katie, have you been taking your medication? I'd had anxiety issues in college, 1 bad semester, a few panic attacks, and suddenly every unusual experience in my life would be filtered through that lens. But this was different. This was real. This was happening whether I was medicated or not. Mel, I'm serious. There are hundreds of them, and they're forming letters, words, my name. Katie, honey, you're scaring me. Maybe you should come stay with us for a while. The house might be too much, too soon, after. I hung up. The next formation appeared an hour later. Why did you? I spent the rest of the day inside, curtains drawn, but I could feel them out there, arranging and rearranging. The sound never stopped, that wet, dragging whisper. And now I could swear I heard something else mixed in. Sobbing, soft, childlike sobbing. By evening, curiosity won. I peered through the kitchen curtains. Katie, why did you forget? Forget what? I wanted to scream. Instead, I opened Grandma Eleanor's journal. She'd kept one for 40 years. Neat handwriting filling page after page. I flipped to the last entries. October 1st. They're getting impatient. The messages are becoming more insistent. Katie arrives tomorrow. God help me. I hope she's strong enough for this. September 28th. Katie needs to know. But how do you tell someone about this without sounding insane? How do you explain that the dead speak through earthworms? September 25th. The earth remembers. The earth always remembers. And it won't let us forget what we've buried. September 22nd. 40 years of keeping the secret. 40 years of midnight messages. 40 years of him asking why nobody came looking in the right place. I'm too old for this burden now, too tired. Katie has the gift. She can help him find peace. September 20th. Mrs. Chen brought over soup today. We talked about Katie, about whether she'd be able to see them. The ability runs in families, she said, but it often skips generations. She's been such a help over the years. The only one who believed me, the only one who understood. I found more as I went back through the months. References to them, to messages, to something that happened in 1978 that she could never forget, no matter how hard she tried. But the earlier entries were different, more detailed, more desperate. March 15th, they formed his name today. Timothy, just like that, stretched across the entire back lawn. Mrs. Chen saw it too. We stood there together, two old women staring at earthworms spelling out the name of a dead boy. January 8th. The dreams are getting worse. He's in my basement now, standing by the furnace pointing at the floor. His clothes are still wet, still muddy. He opens his mouth to speak, but only soil falls out. December 1st. I found a child's toy car in my garden shed today. The red paint is faded, one wheel missing. I know it's his. He's trying to tell me something, trying to show me where the entries went back years, decades. A chronicle of supernatural communication that should have sounded insane but instead felt horribly, undeniably real. That night, the rain pounded even harder. I lay in bed, every nerve on edge, listening. At 3:47 a.m., I heard it again, that dragging sound. But this time, it was coming from inside the house, and underneath it, clear as a bell, a child's voice. "Katie? Katie, are you there?" I crept to the top of the stairs, phone flashlight cutting through the darkness. The sound was coming from the basement. Wet, rhythmic, like something pulling itself across concrete. The basement door was open. I knew I'd locked it. Step by step, I descended. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight. The smell hit me first, rich soil, decay, and underneath it all, something chemical, something wrong. My light swept across the basement floor, and I bit back a scream. They'd come inside, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, covering the concrete in a writhing carpet. And in the center of the room, they'd formed new words, larger this time, more urgent. Remember what you buried. But as I watched, the letters changed, shifted, reformed into something else. I want my mommy. Then again. Katie, help me. I fell to my knees, the phone clattering across the concrete. The worms parted around it, never breaking their formation, and I realized I was crying. Not from fear, though fear was certainly there. From sadness, from the overwhelming grief that filled the basement like water. "Who are you?" I whispered to the writhing letters. The response came immediately, Timothy. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I sat on the porch, watching the rain, trying to make sense of the impossible. As dawn broke, gray and reluctant, I made a decision. First, though, I needed to find that box. The basement looked different in daylight. Normal, no earthworms in sight, but the smell lingered. That rich, loamy scent of turned soil. Behind the furnace, just as Grandma Eleanor's letter had promised, I found a loose stone. The brass key fit perfectly into a small metal box hidden in the cavity behind it. Inside were more newspaper clippings, old photographs, and something else. A child's drawing done in crayon on yellowed paper. It showed a house, my grandmother's house, and two stick figures standing in front of it. One was tall with gray hair. The other was small, with Timothy written above it in careful child's handwriting. At the bottom of the drawing, in different crayon, my friend Ellie. My grandmother's name was Eleanor. but everyone called her Ellie when she was young. The shed behind the house held Grandma's garden tools. I selected a spade, its blade still sharp despite years of use. If something was buried, I was going to find it. The worms were waiting for me, arranged in a new message, under the willow. The willow tree stood at the back of the property, its branches creating a curtain that had always felt like a secret room when I was a child. But now, looking at it with adult eyes and a growing sense of dread, I realized it wasn't just positioned randomly. It was planted deliberately, strategically to hide something. The ground beneath was soft from the rain. I began to dig. 6 inches down, nothing but rich, dark soil. A foot, nothing but more soil, though it seemed to get darker, richer. 2 feet. My spade hit something hard. I scraped away the mud with my hands, revealing a metal box. A cookie tin, the kind Grandma used to store sewing supplies. But this one was sealed with wax, wrapped in plastic, protected. As I lifted it from the ground, I heard them again. Not the worms this time, but voices, whispers in the rain. "Thank you," they seemed to say. "Thank you for listening." Inside the house, I set the tin on the kitchen table. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. The contents were dry, preserved. A stack of newspaper clippings, a small cloth bag, and photographs. The first clipping was from the Millbrook Gazette, dated October 15th, 1978. "Local boy missing. Search continues." The photograph showed a child, maybe 8 years old. Dark hair, gap-toothed smile. The caption read, "Timothy Marsh, age 8. Last seen playing near Millbrook Creek." But there was something else in the photo. In the background, barely visible, stood a woman. Young, maybe 30, pregnant. The image was too blurry to make out her face clearly, but I knew with cold certainty who it was. My mother. The next clipping. 2 weeks later, search for Timothy Marsh called off. And then, a month after that, Marsh family moves from area. Parents can't bear the memories. I spread out the photographs. They showed the house, my grandmother's house, but decades younger. The lawn, the willow tree, and in one, barely visible in the background, a small figure by the creek that ran along the property line. The cloth bag was heavy. I opened it carefully, and 7 small objects tumbled onto the table. Toys. A metal car with 1 wheel missing, the same one I'd read about in Grandma's journal. A plastic soldier, a marble, things a child might carry in his pockets. And at the bottom of the bag, a friendship bracelet, the kind kids made at summer camp. Faded now, but still readable. Ellie and Timmy forever. The final photograph made my blood freeze. It showed my grandmother, young, maybe 30 years old. She was standing by the willow tree, holding a shovel. Her expression was one I'd never seen on her face before. Fear. And something else. Determination. The look of someone who'd made a terrible choice for what she believed were all the right reasons. Behind me, something moved. I spun around to find them again. The worms, they'd somehow gotten inside, were crawling up the kitchen walls, forming letters on the white paint. "He wants to go home." I ran outside, my mind reeling. The rain had become a downpour, turning the yard into a muddy lake. But still they came, surfacing by the thousands, forming larger words across the entire lawn. Timothy is cold. Timothy is scared. Timothy wants his mom. Mrs. Chen was in her yard. Umbrella clutched in one hand. "Katie," she called. "Katie, are you all right?" "Can you see them?" I screamed over the rain. "Can you see the words?" She looked at my lawn, then back at me. Her expression shifted from concern to something else. Recognition? Relief? Your grandmother saw them too, she said quietly. Near the end. Said they wouldn't leave her alone. What happened to Timothy Marsh? Mrs. Chen's face went pale. That's not a question you want answered, dear. Some things are better left buried. But the worms had other plans. Even as she spoke, new letters were forming on her lawn too. Her perfectly manicured, ordinary lawn. Tell her the truth. Mrs. Chen stared at her own yard in shock. They've never... She looked at me with something like awe. You really do have the gift. Stronger than Eleanor ever did. What gift? What are you talking about? The ability to hear them, the restless dead. They're drawn to certain bloodlines, certain families. Your grandmother could see them sometimes, hear them whisper. But you... She gestured at the writing covering both our properties. They're shouting for you. The worms rearrange themselves once more. Tell her about the accident. What accident? I demanded. Mrs. Chen closed her eyes, rain streaming down her face. I was there that day, October 13th, 1978. I was new to the neighborhood, just moved from Taiwan with my husband. English wasn't so good then, but Timothy, he was kind to me, patient. He'd come over after school sometimes, help me with my garden. The letters on her lawn shifted. Nice lady with flowers. He remembered you, I whispered. That day, he came over as usual, but it was raining, had been for days. The creek was running high and fast. I told him to go home, it wasn't safe. But he wanted to show me something first. A fort he'd built in your grandmother's willow tree. More letters formed. Wanted to show secret place. I walked with him. Your mother was there, very pregnant, helping Eleanor hang laundry on the covered porch. The ground was so muddy, so slippery. Timothy ran ahead, excited about his fort, and then the worms on my lawn shifted into a new configuration. Not words this time, but a picture. Crude, made of living lines, but unmistakable. A child falling. An adult reaching out. Impact. He slipped, Mrs. Chen continued. Hit his head on the porch steps. Your mother tried to catch him, but she was so pregnant, so off balance. It happened so fast. I wasn't supposed to die. By the time we reached him, he was gone. Eleanor checked for a pulse, tried mouth to mouth. Nothing. Your mother was hysterical, going into early labor from the stress. I had to choose, help with the birth or report the accident. You chose my mother. I chose life over death. Eleanor made the other choice. Said if anyone found out what happened, your mother would blame herself forever. Said it would destroy her. It wasn't Mommy's fault. The words appeared simultaneously on both lawns, and I realized Timothy had been listening all these years, watching, understanding, accident, not anybody's fault. So you helped her bury him, I said. Mrs. Chen nodded. We waited until dark. Your mother was in the hospital with you, premature but healthy. We wrapped him in his raincoat, the yellow one his mother had bought him. Eleanor wanted him to stay warm. I liked that raincoat. We put his toys with him, the ones that had fallen from his pockets. Eleanor said maybe he'd want them where he was going. Kept me company in the dark. That night, I did what I should have done from the beginning. I researched. The Millbrook Library had digitized their newspaper archives, and I spent hours reading everything from 1978. Timothy Marsh had been playing by the creek after school. It had been raining then, too, the water running high and fast. The official story was that he'd fallen in, been swept away, body never recovered. But the more I read, the more inconsistencies I found. Witnesses had seen him that day, but their stories didn't align. One said he was alone. Another swore they saw him with an adult, a woman. The search had focused on the creek. but dogs had tracked his scent to several houses in the neighborhood before losing it, including my grandmother's house. I found more details in the follow-up articles. Timothy's parents had been devastated, of course, but there were other mentions. A reward offered for information. Private investigators hired when the police search was called off, and then, gradually, the family's growing belief that Timothy hadn't drowned at all. That something else had happened. They'd suspected my grandmother. The articles were subtle about it, but the implication was clear. Timothy's scent had led to her house. He'd been seen in the neighborhood that day, and Eleanor Whitmore had seemed evasive during questioning. But without evidence, without a body, there was nothing the police could do. The family had moved away not just from grief, but from frustration, from the terrible knowledge that they might never know what really happened to their son. My phone rang, startling me from my research. Unknown number. Hello? Breathing, soft, labored. Then a child's voice, faint, distorted. I want to go home. Timothy, I want to see my mommy. I want to tell her I'm okay. The line went dead. I drove back to the house through sheets of rain. The windshield wipers couldn't keep up. Everything blurred, dreamlike, or nightmare-like. The worms had been busy. The entire front lawn was now a canvas. Not just words, but an image. A map. Crude, but recognizable. The house, the willow, the creek, and an X marked directly beneath where I'd found the tin. But there was more. The worms had spread to other yards now. Mrs. Chen's, the Johnsons across the street, old Mr. Peterson's corner lot. All of them covered in writhing pink letters, all saying the same thing: help me go home. I dug deeper this time. 3 feet, 4, 5, the hole filled with water as fast as I could bail it out. My clothes were soaked, my hands raw, but I kept going. At 6 feet, I found it. Not it, him. The small skeleton was wrapped in what had once been a yellow raincoat, the kind every kid wore in the 70s. The bones were small, delicate, arranged with care. Not thrown, placed. Around him were his toys, just as Mrs. Chen had said. The metal car, the plastic soldier, the marble. All of them exactly where a loving adult had placed them, thinking it might bring comfort to a frightened child. I sat back on my heels, rain streaming down my face, and finally understood. My grandmother hadn't killed Timothy Marsh. The positioning, the careful wrapping, the toys buried above him like an offering. She'd found him and hidden him, but not out of cruelty, out of love. Love for my mother, who would have blamed herself forever. Love for me, the premature baby who might not have survived if my mother had been charged with involuntary manslaughter. Love even for Timothy, whom she'd tried to give a peaceful resting place. The worms gave me the answer, spelling it out in letters 10 feet tall across the entire neighborhood. To protect everyone. Not just me, everyone. My mother, my unborn self. Even Timothy's parents, who would have been destroyed by the truth that their son had died because of a simple accident, a moment of childish excitement on a rainy day. But secrets have weight, and 40 years of carrying that weight had nearly crushed my grandmother's spirit. I called Mrs. Chen first. She answered on the first ring. "You found him," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. What will you do?" I looked out at the yard, where thousands of earthworms were still spelling out messages of hope and longing. I'm going to give him what he wants. I'm going to take him home. The hardest part was finding Timothy's family. His parents had passed years ago, but I managed to track down his sister through social media. Rebecca Marsh Collins, living in Portland now. Married. 2 children of her own. And still, after all these years, posting memorial messages about her lost brother every October 13th. I called her on a Thursday morning, told her I'd found something while renovating my grandmother's house. told her she might want to come to Pennsylvania. She arrived 2 days later with her husband and teenage daughter. A small, quiet woman with her brother's dark hair and the same gap-toothed smile in her family photos. "We never stopped looking," she said as we sat in my kitchen. "Mom and Dad hired investigators for years. They were convinced he hadn't drowned, said the creek would have given up his body eventually. They were right." I told her the truth, all of it. The accident, my mother's involvement, my grandmother's desperate decision to hide what had happened. Rebecca listened without interruption, her husband holding her hand, her daughter staring wide-eyed at this stranger who claimed to speak to the dead through earthworms. When I finished, she was crying. "All these years," she whispered. "All these years we thought someone had taken him, that he'd suffered, that he'd been scared and alone and calling for us." "He wasn't alone," I said gently. "My grandmother, she visited his grave every week for 40 years. She brought him flowers, toys at Christmas. She talked to him. Nice lady." The worms had formed the words on the kitchen floor, and Rebecca's daughter pointed, gasping. "Mom, look!" She brought me books sometimes, read stories. Rebecca stared at the writhing letters, then at me. Is that really Timothy?" I said. "He's been trying to get home to you for a long time." The funeral was small. Just Rebecca's family, Mrs. Chen, myself, and the pastor from Millbrook Methodist. We buried Timothy in the cemetery plot his parents had purchased 40 years ago, the one that had sat empty all this time, waiting. Rebecca had brought photos, pictures of the family he'd never grown up with. His parents at their 50th anniversary, Rebecca's wedding, her children's births, Timothy's nephew and niece who looked so much like him it was startling. "He would have been Uncle Timmy," Rebecca said, placing the photos in the small casket we'd bought. "He would have spoiled them rotten." During the service, I felt it. A lightness in the air, a sense of completion. The oppressive weight that had hung over my grandmother's house for decades was finally lifting. That night, for the first time since I'd arrived in Millbrook, it didn't rain, and the worms went back to being worms. Random, chaotic, natural, except I kept the house. How could I leave? I'm the only one who knows the whole truth, the real truth, that my grandmother spent 40 years being reminded of her choice, 40 years of messages, 40 years of guilt manifesting in ways that science can't explain. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. The gift didn't disappear with Timothy's burial. If anything, it's gotten stronger. Last month, during a particularly heavy storm, I found new messages spelled out in worms on my lawn. Not from Timothy this time, someone else. A woman named Margaret, who'd been buried in an unmarked grave behind the old asylum in 1962. She wants her daughter to know she didn't abandon her. 2 weeks ago, a child's message appeared. Tell them about the fire. I'm still researching that one, but I think it has something to do with the schoolhouse that burned down in 1934. And just yesterday, covering my entire front yard in neat, precise letters, "We know you can hear us." Plural, not one voice, but many. Mrs. Chen has been helping me research the cases. She's become something of an expert on local history, and her English has improved dramatically over the years. We spend our evenings in my kitchen, going through old newspaper archives and cemetery records, trying to match names to messages. "You realize what this means," she said last night, looking up from a 1920s death certificate. "If they can reach you from anywhere, if the gift is this strong." I nodded. I'd been thinking the same thing. How many unmarked graves are there in Millbrook? How many unresolved disappearances? How many families who never got closure because the truth was buried along with the bodies? If the worms could spell out Timothy's story, if the earth really does remember everything, what else is it trying to tell us? What other secrets are buried in backyards and basements, under willow trees and rose gardens, waiting for the rain to bring them to the surface? The other day, I got a call from a woman in Michigan. She'd found my story online, in one of the forums where people discuss unexplained phenomena. "It's happening here too," she said. "The worms. They're spelling out a name. Someone called David. I think he's buried in my backyard." I gave her my phone number, told her to call when she was ready to dig. Because here's what I've learned in the months since Timothy found his peace. The dead don't rest easy when they're forgotten. They don't stay quiet when their stories remain untold. And sometimes, just sometimes, the earth itself becomes their voice. So I ask you, next time it rains, really rains, go outside, look at your lawn, look carefully, because sometimes, just sometimes, the earth has something to say, and it won't stop until someone listens. If you made it this far, you're braver than most. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories like this. And seriously, check your yard next time it rains. Check it carefully. You never know what messages might be waiting for you. Leave a comment below if you've ever seen something you couldn't explain. Something that made you question what's possible. I read every single one, and lately, I've been getting a lot of emails from people who've started seeing their own messages. The network is growing. The voices are getting stronger. Because the earth remembers. The earth always remembers. And sometimes, it wants us to remember too. Sweet dreams. Now, sleep. Or at least, try to. It's quiet now, too quiet, but not empty. That feeling crawling up your spine, that weight pressing on your chest, that's not your imagination. You're not alone. There's something behind the curtain. You haven't looked, not because you forgot, but because you're afraid to know. You heard the whisper, soft where wet, wrong. Like breath dragged across broken glass. But you told yourself it was the wind, didn't you? That lie made you feel safe. Temporarily. Let me ask you, does the wind whisper your name? Does the wind tap lightly, again and again, from the same spot, behind the curtain, every night? Does the wind leave scratches on your window that weren't there this morning? Thin, sharp, like claws, like warnings. You don't remember opening the window. You never open the window. But it's unlocked now. You could check, you could stand up, you could walk over and pull the curtain back. But you won't, because you know. You know what's waiting, not because you've seen it, but because you felt it. In the quiet, in the dark. Every time you close your eyes, every time you wake up and your blanket is just slightly moved. Your door slightly cracked. You try to explain it. Your mind wants to explain it. But that whisper, that sound that only comes when you're alone, when everything is still, when the night is at its deepest, that's not a dream, that's a presence. It doesn't want your fear, it wants your attention. It feeds on the moment you doubt yourself. The second you wonder if you heard something, the instant your heart rate rises. That's when it leans closer. It's been patient, watching, learning you like prey. You ever notice it never shows up when the lights are on, when someone's in the room? It waits for the ritual, the brushing of your teeth, the turning off of lights, the last look at your phone, the deep breath just before sleep. That's when it wakes up. That's when it stirs behind the curtain. Sometimes it watches you all night. Sometimes it moves. A shift in the shadow. A faint creak on the floorboards. The sound of fabric sliding over skin. And when you don't check, when you ignore it, that's when it comes closer. Not fast, not loud, just closer. You might feel a cold spot on the bed. You might feel breath on your neck. You might hear a whisper in your ear that sounds almost like your voice. It copies, it mimics, it blends, not to confuse you, to prepare you, because soon it won't need the curtain, it won't need shadows, it will sit beside you, stand behind you, speak through you. You won't even know when it happens. You'll wake up, look in the mirror, and something will be off. Your eyes won't blink quite right, your smile will linger too long. Your reflection will move just a little after you do. And the people around you? They'll say you seem different. Not worse, just not you. But tonight you're still you. Still in control, for now. You could still check. You could still confront it. Pull the curtain back, face it, but deep down, you've already made your choice. You won't. Because you'd rather lie still, let your eyes drift shut, and hope sleep comes quickly. And it will. But what you wake up as might not be the same. Now, if you've made it this far, congratulations. You're not just a viewer, you're part of something bigger. Something that watches with you, that sits beside you as you watch, as you listen, as you wait. Because this story doesn't end when the screen fades to black. It follows you into the next room, into your dreams, into your reflection. If you liked this story, like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss the next one, so we don't miss you. And comment below. Tell us the moment you stopped feeling alone. We're watching, we're listening, and we read everything. Now, go ahead, gain the courage to check the dark corners before you sleep. Turn off the lights, close your eyes, sleep well, if you can.